The branding iron was half buried in the ash of a dead campfire when Silas Collier found it, and the two letters burned deep into its wooden handle changed the entire course of his life. He had been riding south through the Texas panhandle in the autumn of 1878, following the Canadian River toward a cattle buyer in Tascosa who owed him money for 3 months of trail work. The morning was cold and gray, the kind of morning that made a man pull his coat tight and keep his eyes on the ground, which was exactly why he spotted the abandoned campsite at all. It sat just off the trail in a shallow draw, sheltered by a cluster of cottonwood trees that had gone yellow with the season, their leaves trembling in the wind like nervous fingers. Someone had made camp there recently, maybe 2 nights ago by the look of the ash, which still held a faint warmth when he pressed his palm near it. He almost rode past. He almost told himself it was none of his business, which was a philosophy he had lived by since he was 19 years old and learned the hard way that curiosity had a price. But the campsite was strange. Not dangerous strange, not ambush strange, just the kind of wrong that made a man's instincts hum quietly. There were signs of a hasty departure. A tin coffee cup lay on its side. A length of rope had been left coiled around a cottonwood root. A bedroll that had been hastily bundled was shoved under a fallen log as though someone had been running and could not carry everything. And there was the branding iron. It was a simple tool, maybe 18 inches of iron rod bent at the end into a shape, and he could see even from horseback that it had been used recently because the burned end still had the faint smell of scorched metal about it. He dismounted, tied his horse to the cottonwood, and crouched beside the campfire pit. He picked up the iron and turned it in his hands, studying the bent end first. The brand shape was a simple connected RR, 2 letters looped together in a way that could belong to a small ranching outfit. But it was the handle that made him go still. Burned into the wood, deliberately and carefully, not carved but actually burned with some small instrument, were 2 initials. RR. The letters were neat and precise, not scratched in a hurry but placed with the kind of patience that meant something. A person had taken time with this, had pressed a hot nail or a thin piece of iron to the wood and drawn those letters slowly. RR. Not a ranch brand this time, something personal, a name. Silas Collier was 28 years old in the autumn of 1878. He had been cowboying since he was 16, had driven cattle from Texas to Kansas 3 times, had worked ranges in New Mexico and Colorado, and had never once in all those years found a reason to change his direction based on anything other than where the work was. He was not a man who chased mystery. He was not a man who chased anything, really. He was practical and quiet, and people who hired him said he was the most dependable hand they had ever seen, and people who tried to befriend him said he was the hardest man to know they had ever met. But he stood there in that cottonwood draw holding that branding iron, looking at those 2 neat letters in the wood, and something moved in him that he could not name. He thought about the rope left behind. He thought about the overturned cup. He thought about the bedroll shoved under the log as though someone had been frightened and had fled in the night, and had left this iron behind because it was heavy and they were moving fast. He thought about whoever had taken the time to burn their initials into a tool's handle, lovingly and carefully, the way a person marks something they intend to keep. He put the branding iron across his saddle and rode south, but he was not thinking about the cattle buyer in Tascosa anymore. The town of Mineral Creek was not on any map that Silas had ever seen, but the old Mexican herder he met at a crossroads 2 miles south of the cottonwood draw told him about it without being asked. The man was moving a small herd of goats northward, and he stopped when he saw Silas, looked at the branding iron tied to the saddle, and said in careful English that there had been trouble on the Ralston place. Silas pulled up. "Ralston," the old man nodded. He gestured south and east, toward a low line of brown hills. "The woman who runs that ranch, she had trouble too, maybe 3 nights ago. Men came. I heard the noise from my camp," He paused, studying Silas with dark and careful eyes. "You know this woman?" "No," Silas said honestly, "but I found something of hers." The old man looked at the iron again, then back at Silas's face, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. He gave Silas directions to Mineral Creek and told him the Ralston homestead was another 4 miles east of town, on the south side of a dry creek bed, marked by a pair of old cedar posts at the entrance. Silas thanked him and rode on. He reached Mineral Creek at midday. It was a small town, the kind that had sprung up along the cattle trails and might last another decade or might be gone in 5 years depending on the railroad. There was a single main street with a general store, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a livery stable, a land office that appeared to have been closed for some time, and a small building with a painted sign that read sheriff but whose door was also closed. There were perhaps a dozen other structures scattered around, houses and storage buildings, and a small church that had not yet been painted. The general store was open. A woman in a gray dress was sweeping the porch, and she watched Silas ride up with the flat, measuring look that small-town people reserved for strangers. "Excuse me, ma'am," Silas said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm looking for some information about the Ralston homestead east of here." The woman stopped sweeping. "Are you a friend of Ruth's?" "Not yet," he said. "I found something out on the trail that I think belongs to her. I'd like to return it." The woman on the porch set her broom against the wall and crossed her arms. Her name, he would learn later, was Cora Fleming, and she had been the closest thing Ruth Ralston had to a friend in Mineral Creek for the past 2 years. She looked at Silas with the particular scrutiny of a woman who has watched her friend go through difficulty and does not intend to let trouble find her again. "What did you find?" she asked. He untied the branding iron from his saddle and held it up. "This." Cora Fleming's expression shifted in a way he could not entirely read. There was recognition there and relief and something that might have been sadness. "Where did you find that?" "In a draw about 6 miles north in a cottonwood stand near the Canadian River, abandoned campsite, someone left in a hurry." Cora was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Ruth left 3 nights ago. We haven't seen her since." Her neighbor, Jeb Hankins, rode out to her place the morning after and found the house empty and the stock unattended. He's been going out twice a day to feed her animals. Silas felt something drop in his stomach. "You think she's in danger?" "I think she was in danger 3 nights ago," Cora said. "Whether she still is, I can't say. But those men who came to her place, they weren't decent men. Everyone in this town knows what kind of men they were." "What kind were they?" Cora looked at him for another long moment. Then she stepped off the porch and said, "Come inside. I'll tell you what I know, and you can tell me why a stranger is riding 6 miles out of his way to return a branding iron to a woman he's never met." The inside of the general store smelled of coffee and dried beans and harness leather. Cora poured him a cup of coffee from a pot on the stove, and they sat across from each other at a small table near the window, and she told him the story of Ruth Ralston. Ruth had come to the Texas Panhandle 2 years ago, in the spring of 1876, from a place called Denison in the northeast part of the state. She had come alone, which was unusual enough, and she had used her own money to file a claim on 160 acres of land under the Homestead Act, which was unusual for a woman but not impossible, and she had proceeded to work that land with a stubbornness and a practicality that had earned her the grudging respect of most of the men in the county and the open admiration of all the women. She was 26 years old. She had no family in the area. She had built a small herd of cattle from a starting point of 8 animals, had put up fencing, had dug a well, and had refused every offer of help or courtship that came her way with equal and calm politeness. The trouble had started 3 months ago when a man named Denton Pruitt had ridden onto her property and told her he was buying up land in the area for a ranching syndicate out of Fort Worth. He had offered her a price for her claim that was fair by some measures and insulting by others, given what she had put into the land and what it was now worth. She had refused. He had come back 2 more times, and each time she had refused, and after the third refusal his visits had stopped being polite. 3 nights ago, 2 men had ridden to her homestead after dark. Her nearest neighbor, Jeb Hankins, had heard horses and seen lantern light moving in the direction of her place but had not gone to investigate until morning. What he found was a homestead that appeared intact but completely abandoned. The cattle were in the pasture, the chickens were in the yard, the front door of the house was closed but not latched, and Ruth Ralston was gone. "The sheriff," Silas said when Cora finished. "His office looks closed." Cora's mouth went thin and flat. "Tom Briggs has been the sheriff of this county for 4 years. He is also the cousin of Denton Pruitt's business partner." She let that sit for a moment. He looked around Ruth's property for about 20 minutes and told Jeb Hankins that a woman living alone on a homestead had probably just moved on. Said maybe she took a better offer. Silas sat with his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the branding iron lying on the table between them. The RR on the handle was clear even in the dim interior light of the store. "What does the RR stand for?" he asked. "Ruth Ralston," Cora said. Her father's name was Ralston too. She put those initials on anything valuable that she didn't want to lose track of. Tools, her good saddle, the lid of her document box. She paused. She burned them on herself with a small iron she kept in the fire for that purpose. She was particular about her things. Silas picked up the branding iron again and traced the letters with his thumb. He thought about a woman sitting by a fire, pressing a hot implement carefully against wood, drawing 2 neat letters that said, "This is mine." He thought about someone who was particular about her things. "I'd like to ride out to her property," he said. Cora studied him. "You haven't told me who you are or why you're doing this." "My name is Silas Collier. I've been cowboying for 12 years. I'm traveling through on my way to Tascosa, or I was." He set the iron down. "I don't have a better reason than this. Someone took time to put their name on something they cared about, and then they were scared away from it, and that bothers me more than it probably should." Cora Fleming looked at him for a long time. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it. "Jeb Hankins can take you out there," she said. "He's been in and out every day. He'll want to know what you found." Jeb Hankins was a heavy-set man of about 45 with sunburned forearms and a white mustache, and the permanent squint of a man who had spent decades working outdoors in the Texas sun. He was skeptical of Silas in the way that slow-burning and practical men are skeptical of anyone they don't know. But he was also clearly worried about Ruth Ralston, and worry made him willing to accept unlikely help. They rode out together that afternoon, and on the way Jeb told Silas things that Cora had not. He told him that Denton Pruitt was not a man who used violence personally, but that he was a man who hired it without hesitation. He told him that the 2 men who had been seen near Ruth's property on previous occasions were a pair known locally as the Calvert brothers, Hale and Das, who had been doing Pruitt's rougher work for the better part of a year. And he told Silas that Ruth Ralston was not the first person to leave their homestead after those 2 paid a visit, though she was the first who had run rather than simply signing over her deed under pressure. "Which means she got away," Silas said. "Maybe. Or they let her go and are running her down at their own pace." Jeb shook his head. "Either way, a woman alone out here with no money and nothing but what she could carry, that's dangerous. It's been cold at night." Ruth's homestead was everything Cora had described, and more. It sat on a gentle rise above a dry creek bed, a modest but well-built house of adobe brick with a shaded porch, a solid barn, a tight fence line running in all 4 directions from a central post, and a water trough that Jeb had recently filled. The cattle in the near pasture were a mixed breed, a mix of longhorns and some shorter-horned animals, and they were in decent condition. There were perhaps 18 of them. The horses were gone from the corral, which meant Ruth had taken at least 1 animal with her. The house was the telling thing. Silas walked through it slowly while Jeb fed the cattle, and he read the story of that night in the details. There was a cast iron stove in the main room with a meal half prepared on it, a pot of beans that had dried out and crusted, and told him she had left in the evening, not long after she began cooking supper. The front door had no damage, no splintered wood, no broken latch, which meant she had heard or seen those men coming and had chosen to run rather than confront them. That was smart. That was the decision of a woman who had been watching for danger and had a plan ready. She had taken a saddle bag because the hook near the door where it hung was empty. She had taken her coat because there was a second hook with no coat. She had left almost everything else, which confirmed she had gone fast and light on horseback into the dark. On the table in the main room there was a small wooden box with a brass latch. It was closed but not locked, and Silas hesitated before opening it because that felt like an intrusion. But Jeb came in from the barn and said, "Open it. If there's anything in there that helps us figure out where she'd go, we need to know." Inside the box were several folded papers. Land deed, homestead claim papers, a letter from a bank in Denison acknowledging a small deposit. There was also a photograph, mounted on a stiff paper backing the way studio photographs were in that era. It showed a young woman seated in a chair with a plain backdrop behind her. She was not smiling, because people did not smile in photographs in 1878, the exposure time being too long for such things. But there was something in the set of her expression that was not exactly severity either. She had dark hair pinned carefully, clear eyes, and a straight posture that communicated a person entirely at home in herself. She was, Silas thought, quite beautiful, and then he felt faintly embarrassed by the thought because he was standing in a stranger's empty house, thinking about a woman he had never spoken a word to. He put the photograph back. There was also, tucked into the corner of the box, a piece of folded paper that was different from the others. When he unfolded it, he found a short list of names and places in a neat, small handwriting. Denison, Red River Crossing, a name Martha Coolidge with an address in a town called Wheeler. Another name, a woman named Nell with no address beyond the word Mobedy, which was a small town roughly 60 miles southeast of Mineral Creek. "These are people she knows," Silas said. "Safe places." Jeb looked over his shoulder at the list. "Mobedy is closer, 2 days' ride if you push." Silas refolded the paper carefully and put it back in the box exactly as he had found it. He looked around the room one more time at the half-made supper, at the empty hook where the saddlebag had hung, at the photograph in the box. Then he looked at Jeb Hankins. "I'm going to Mobedy," he said. Jeb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't know this woman." "No, and yet you're going 60 miles out of your way." "Yes." Jeb scratched the back of his neck and looked at the ceiling. "I'll wire the county seat from the telegraph office in Mineral Creek, see if anyone there has seen her." "You go south." Silas left at first light the following morning, riding south on a horse named Cutter, a solid gray animal that he had owned for 3 years and trusted entirely. He took the branding iron with him, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tied behind his saddle. He rode through a landscape that was beautiful in the pale and specific way of the Texas high plains in October, wide and tawny and enormous. The sky above it, a deep blue that pressed down on everything like the ceiling of a very large room. He passed a few other travelers on the trail, a freighter moving north, a pair of soldiers heading west, a family in a wagon who looked tired and did not make eye contact. He thought about Ruth Ralston as he rode. He thought about her in the careful, analytical way that he applied to most problems, not romantically, not in the way he had felt briefly embarrassed about the day before, but practically. She was smart, he had concluded from the evidence. She had left fast when she needed to. She had a plan. She had kept a list of safe places in a box with her important papers. She was, by all accounts, a woman who had come out here alone and built something real with her own hands, and whoever had threatened her into running was in the wrong, and that made him feel a dull and uncomplicated anger. He camped the first night along a creek and made a small fire and ate beans from a can, and drank coffee and lay on his back looking at the stars, which were thick and clear the way they only were when you were far from any town. He was not a man who talked to himself or argued with his own decisions, but that night He spent a quiet hour simply understanding that he was doing something he had not done before, which was following a feeling rather than a paycheck, and he was not sure what to make of that. He reached the outskirts of Mobedi on the afternoon of the second day. Mobedi was a real town, established originally as a buffalo hunter's camp and now serving as the seat of Wheeler County, with Fort Elliott nearby and a population of several hundred people, which was substantial for this part of the country. There was a proper main street, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, a school building, several mercantile stores, and a functioning sheriff's office that looked like it was actually used. Silas asked at the livery stable first, because livery men saw every horse that came through a town. The man who ran it was young, maybe 20 years old, with a gap in his front teeth and quick eyes. "I'm looking for a woman who may have ridden in 2 or 3 days ago," Silas said. "Dark hair, alone on horseback, probably moving fast and looking tired." The young man thought about it. Lots of people come through. This one would have been notable. A woman alone at night or near dark. Possibly her horse was lathered. The young man leaned on his pitchfork. "There was a woman came in 3 nights ago. Late. I remember because it was past my usual hours and she knocked on the door here. Her horse had thrown a shoe and she was worried about the animal." He paused. "Dark hair, yeah, she looked like she'd been riding hard." Silas kept very still. "Did she say where she was going?" "Said she had a friend here in town. A woman named Nell something." He scratched his chin. "I gave her directions to the boarding house on 2nd Street. That's where most of the single women in town stay when they're passing through." Silas thanked him and walked his horse up the main street to 2nd Street, which was not actually a street so much as a wide, rutted path with 4 or 5 buildings on it, including a 2-story frame building with a sign that said accommodation, Mrs. Pearl Reardon, clean rooms. He tied Cutter to the rail and went inside. Mrs. Pearl Reardon was a broad, energetic woman of perhaps 50 who regarded Silas with the comfortable authority of a person entirely in control of her domain. She told him before he could say much of anything that she ran a respectable establishment and that men were not permitted above the 1st floor. "Yes, ma'am," Silas said. "I'm not looking for a room. I'm looking for a woman named Ruth Ralston. I have something of hers." Mrs. Reardon looked at the length of oilcloth under his arm. "What is that?" "A branding iron." She stared at him for a moment. "What is your name?" "Silas Collier." She went to the foot of the stairs and called up, "Ruth. There's a man down here says he has something of yours." There was a long silence from above, then footsteps, slow and cautious, on the stairs. Ruth Ralston came into view a step at a time, and Silas stood in the front room of that boarding house and looked at her and felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a word for. She was the woman from the photograph, but she was also more than the photograph, the way people always are in the flesh. She was perhaps 5 feet 4 inches, with the kind of dark hair he had noticed in the picture, pinned back but with several strands loose around her face. She was wearing a borrowed dress that was slightly too large for her, and she was clearly tired, with shadows under her eyes and a careful tension in her shoulders that was the residue of recent fear. She was 26 years old, and she was looking at him with an expression that mixed wariness with something that might have been desperate hope. She was also, undeniably, exactly as beautiful as he had thought from the photograph, and this time he did not feel embarrassed by the observation because it seemed simply and plainly true. "Who are you?" she said. She stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom, keeping the height advantage, which he noticed and appreciated as an intelligent choice. "Silas Collier, a cowboy. I was riding south through the panhandle 3 days ago and I found an abandoned campsite in a draw by the Canadian River." He held up the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped it. "I found this." Ruth's eyes went to the branding iron and something happened in her face that was too complicated to name. Her hand moved to the banister and gripped it. "Where exactly did you find that?" "Cottonwood Stand, maybe 6 miles north of Mineral Creek, just east of the river." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The initials on the handle." "RR," he said. "I went to Mineral Creek. I spoke with a woman named Cora Fleming and a man named Jeb Hankins." They told me about your situation, and I rode here." "You rode 60 miles," she said, "to return a branding iron." "Yes." Ruth Ralston stared at him. The wariness in her expression had not gone away, but it had shifted, rearranged itself into something that was trying to understand what was in front of her. "Why?" Silas considered this honestly, the way he considered most things. "I'm not entirely sure," he said. "But someone who takes time to put their name on their tools is someone who intends to keep them. And someone who had to run and leave that behind deserves to get it back." She came the rest of the way down the stairs. She crossed the room to him and took the branding iron from his hands, and he let her have it. She turned it in her hands and looked at the initials on the handle for a long time. Then she looked up at him. "You spoke to Cora and Jeb," she said, "so you know about Prout." "I know what they told me." "Then you know I can't go back there, not as things stand." She said it flatly, without self-pity, as a statement of current fact. "Those men will come back, and the sheriff won't help me." "I know about the sheriff," Silas said, "and I'd like to talk to you about your options if you're willing." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned to Mrs. Reardon, who had been standing in the doorway to the kitchen pretending not to listen. "Pearl, could we use your sitting room?" "Of course," Pearl said immediately, abandoning all pretense of not listening. They sat in the boarding house sitting room on opposite sides of a small table, with a lamp between them because the afternoon light was failing outside. Ruth made tea from Pearl's kitchen and brought it to the table herself, and Silas drank it, though he would have strongly preferred coffee, because it would have been impolite to say so. He told her everything. He told her about finding the campsite, about the rope and the cup and the sense of hasty departure. He told her about the conversation with Cora and the ride out to her homestead with Jeb and what he had seen there. He told her about the document box and said plainly that he had looked at the list of names inside it and that this was how he had known to come to Mobedy, and he apologized for the intrusion. He told her that Jeb was sending a telegraph to the county seat and watching her livestock. Ruth listened to all of this without interrupting, which he noted. She had a still quality about her when she was thinking, the quality of a person who gathered information before drawing conclusions. When he finished, she wrapped her hands around her teacup and was quiet for a moment. "The county seat is Clarendon," she said. "Their sheriff is better than Tom Briggs, but Prout has influence there too. It won't be fast." "Maybe not, but it's a place to start." He paused. "The land deed, is it in your name? Filed and recorded. I have the original in that box and I know the recording number." She met his eyes. "I haven't done anything wrong. The land is mine. I filed correctly. I paid the fees. I've made the improvements required by the Homestead Act. Prout has no legal basis for taking it, which is why he's using other methods." "Yes." A brief darkness moved across her face and then was gone. "The Calvert brothers." Hale Calvert told me, the second time Prout sent him, that accidents happen to people who are unreasonable. She said it evenly, but he could hear the edge beneath the evenness. "He threatened you directly. As directly as a man can manage while still maintaining the ability to claim he didn't." She looked at the branding iron which sat on the table between them. "That iron belonged to my father. He started the brand, the double R, when he had a small ranch in Denison. He died 4 years ago. When I came out here, I brought it with me to start my own herd. I thought I'd continue his brand." She touched the handle with one finger. "I put the initials on it myself when I got here, so that it would be mine, not just his." Silas looked at the letters burned into the wood. He thought about a woman alone in a new territory, pressing a hot iron to a handle, marking something as hers. "It's a good brand," he said. Something shifted in her expression. It was not exactly a smile, but it was the warmth underneath a smile. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Collier? Honestly." "I told you honestly, I'm not entirely sure." "That's not a satisfying answer." "I know. I'll tell you when I figure it out." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did smile, briefly and slightly, and it changed her whole face in a way that landed somewhere in his chest and stayed there. Over the next 2 days in Mobedy, they talked. Not constantly, not without the proper distances that 1878 required between a man and a woman who were not acquainted, but they found time and space for it. Ruth's friend Nell, whose full name was Nell Graves and who kept a small dressmaking shop on the main street, hosted them both for supper on the first evening, along with Nell's husband, a blacksmith named George who was a quiet and good-natured man. They sat around a proper supper table and ate roasted chicken and cornbread, and Ruth and Nell talked with the ease of old friendship, and Silas sat across from Ruth and watched her be at ease in a way she had not been in the boarding house, and he learned things about her from that ease. She laughed more freely than he had expected. She had opinions about things, delivered calmly and without apology. She had read more than most people he knew, and she was not shy about it. She asked him questions that were direct and curious, and that showed she had been listening to everything he said. And when he answered, she listened with the same quality of attention. By the end of the supper, he was aware that he had talked more in one evening than he typically talked in a week, and that it had not felt uncomfortable. Walking back to the boarding house through the cool October night, Ruth said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know, someone who wanted something. Most men who go out of their way to find me want something." He thought about this. "I want you to be able to go back to your homestead," he said. "Does that count?" She looked at him in the darkness. "That might be the one thing I'd allow." He stayed in Mobedy. He had not planned to stay past a day, but there were things to work out and leaving felt wrong. He wrote a letter to the cattle buyer in Tascosa explaining his delay, which cost him the money he was owed because the man was not a patient sort, and he found he did not mind as much as he should have. He wired Jeb Hankins to report his finding Ruth safe and to thank him for the livestock care. He also, on the second day, rode to the Wheeler County Sheriff's Office and explained the situation to the man there, a steady-looking individual named Harlan Cross who listened carefully and asked good questions. Sheriff Cross said that Pruitt's land acquisition activities had come to his attention before through other complaints, and that while he had no jurisdiction in Mineral Creek's county, he could write to the appropriate authorities and add his voice to any formal complaint Ruth chose to make. He also said, with the directness of a man who dealt in practical realities, that a woman alone on a homestead with one corrupt sheriff and a powerful enemy was in a genuinely dangerous position, and that legal remedies were slow. "She needs to go back," Cross said. "Abandonment of the claim could be used against her. Every day she's gone is a day Pruitt can argue she's given up the land." Silas brought this back to Ruth that evening. They sat on the boarding house porch in the cold with blankets around their shoulders because the inside was warm, but the conversation felt like one that needed open air. She listened and then was quiet for a long time. "I know," she said finally. "I've been telling myself the same thing. I just needed a day or two to stop shaking." He looked at her. "You were shaking." "Inside. I'm not very good at showing it." She pulled the blanket tighter. "Those men came at night, and I heard them talking outside, and I knew what they were there to do. I went out the back window and I took my horse and I rode until I couldn't any more, and then I camped, and the next morning I rode again." She paused. "I dropped the branding iron when my horse shied in the dark. I was moving too fast to go back for it." "And then you burned it in your mind for days," Silas said. She looked at him, startled. "Yes, exactly that. It matters. The things we make and mark and try to keep." She was looking at him with that complicated expression again, the one that was trying to categorize what he was. He held her gaze and let her look. "I want to go back," she said. "Will you come with me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. They left Mobedy the following morning. Ruth had borrowed enough from Nell to replace the few things she had lost in the flight, and she rode her own horse, a bay mare named Petra, with the branding iron newly wrapped and tied to her saddle behind her. Silas rode beside her on Cutter, and they went north through the high plains under a sky that was enormous and blue and cold, and full of the kind of silence that is not empty, but is instead full of everything that has no name. They talked as they rode, in the unhurried way of people who have a long distance to cover and are not uncomfortable in each other's presence. She told him about her father, the original Ralston whose brand she was carrying forward. He had been a good man, she said, quiet and capable and not one for speeches, the kind of man whose worth you understood by watching him work rather than by listening to him talk. He had died of a lung infection in the winter of 1874, and her mother had died years before that, when Ruth was 12. She had been on her own in practical terms since she was 22, and in real terms since she was much younger. Why the panhandle? Silas asked. Why come all the way out here? Because it was available and I could afford it, and no one would tell me it was strange for me to be here, she said. Denison was full of people who had known my father and thought they had opinions about what I should do next. Out here, nobody knew me. I could just be what I actually am. What is that? She thought about it. Someone who wants to build something real, something that lasts. I don't have grand ambitions. I just want a piece of land that's mine and cattle that I've bred and a place where I can make my own decisions. That's not a small ambition, Silas said. Most people never manage it. She glanced at him. What about you? 12 years of cowboying. That's a long time to work other people's land. He had not thought about it in quite those terms. The question sat in him for a while before he answered. I don't know, he said finally. I started because it was what there was. I stayed because I was good at it and it suited my nature. But lately he stopped. Lately I've been wondering if being good at something is the same as wanting it. Ruth looked at the horizon. No, she said quietly. It's not. They made camp that night along the same creek where Silas had camped on his way south. The irony of it was not lost on either of them. They built a fire and she made coffee and he cooked salt pork and beans and they ate together. And the fire was warm and the stars above were the same thick blanket of light they always were out here. And something about the evening felt unexpectedly ordinary in the best way. The way a thing can feel familiar before it has any right to. Ruth said, looking at the fire, Why did you really come after me? He looked at her. The firelight moved on her face and she was looking at the flames, not at him, which gave him the latitude to look at her without embarrassment. I told you, the initials. But you could have left the iron in Mineral Creek with Cora, or mailed it. Or just left it there in the draw and ridden on. She finally looked at him. You didn't, you came 60 miles. He was quiet for a moment. The initials, he said again, but differently this time without the cover of practicality. I looked at those letters and I thought about whoever had made them and I couldn't stop. I couldn't get it out of my head, the idea that someone careful enough to mark their things was scared away from everything they'd built. It felt wrong. It felt like something I couldn't ride past. She held his gaze across the fire. You are not what I expected, she said again, soft this time. You keep saying that, because I keep discovering it's true. The second day's ride brought them back into the territory around Mineral Creek. They stopped at Cora Fleming's store first, because it seemed the right thing to do. Cora came off the porch when she saw them coming, and her relief at seeing Ruth was immediate and uncomplicated, and she hugged her with the warmth of a woman who had been genuinely worried. Then she looked at Silas over Ruth's shoulder with an expression that contained a mixture of approval and something that might have been amusement. Jeb Hankins came into town while they were at the store, having seen them from a distance on the road, and he and Ruth had a quiet conversation in the corner of the store that Silas did not listen to, but could see was emotional in the way of a woman expressing gratitude to a man who had shown up when he didn't have to. Jeb looked gruff and embarrassed about the whole thing, which was exactly right. They went to the homestead that afternoon. Ruth walked through her own house with a kind of careful attention, checking each room, touching things she had not expected to see again. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the dried and crusted pot of beans on the stove, and she said nothing for a long moment, and then she picked it up and carried it outside and set it on the porch. And Silas understood that small act as a form of ceremony, a way of putting 3 nights of fear aside and returning to the ordinary business of living. He stayed. Not in the house, which would have been inappropriate by every standard of the time, but in the barn, which was dry and warmer than the outdoors and which had a decent hayloft. He had nowhere pressing to be. The money from Tascosa was gone, lost to his delay, but he had savings and the decision to stay felt right in a way that financial logic did not disturb. Over the following weeks, he helped with the ranch. Not because she asked, but because there was work and he could do it, and she was sensible enough to accept help without making a performance of gratitude. They worked side by side through the October days, mending fence and moving cattle and winterizing the barn, and they developed the comfortable rhythm of people who are naturally well matched in the practical sense, who do not get in each other's way and can anticipate what the other is doing without needing to be told. And they talked. In the evenings especially, on the porch if it was not too cold, or inside at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and coffee on the stove. They talked about everything, about the state of the cattle range, and the coming winter, and the political situation in the territory and books they had read, and what they thought about life and death, and what it meant to build something worthwhile. Ruth was the best conversation Silas had ever had, and he knew it, and the knowledge kept surprising him. The situation with Prute had not resolved. The letter to the county seat had been sent. Sheriff Cross in Wheeler County had written his own letter. But legal processes moved slowly, and Prute's men had been seen twice at the edge of Ruth's property, not approaching, just watching, which was its own form of threat. Ruth met this with a steadiness that impressed him enormously. She was not unafraid. He could see the fear sometimes, in the way she listened at night when the wind made unusual sounds, in the way she kept a loaded rifle by the door, which she was, he discovered, quite competent with. But she did not let the fear run her. She got up every morning and did her work and held her ground. On a cold Thursday in early November, 3 weeks after Silas had brought her home, Hale Calvert rode to the homestead. He came alone, which was interesting. He was a big man, wide through the chest, with a broad face and small eyes that moved constantly, the eyes of a man who had learned to watch for exits. He came up the drive slowly and stopped his horse at the gate and called out, and Ruth came to the porch and Silas came to stand beside her. Calvert looked at Silas with those small moving eyes and then back at Ruth. "Prute wants to talk," he said. "He's willing to improve his offer." "Tell him what I told you before," Ruth said. "The land isn't for sale." "Ma'am," Calvert shifted in his saddle. His eyes went to Silas again, measuring. "Your situation has changed somewhat. Having a man around might make things different for Prute's calculus." "I'm still here," Ruth said. "The land is still mine. His calculus doesn't affect those facts." Calvert looked at Silas one more time, and there was something in his look that Silas returned steadily, without aggression but without backing down either, the look of a man who has decided where he is standing and does not require conversation about it. Calvert turned his horse and rode away without another word. Ruth let out a slow breath. "Well," she said, "he'll report back," Silas said. "Prute will think about it. And then we'll see what kind of man he is. If he's smart, he'll back down. If he's stubborn, he'll try again." He looked at her. "But you've got more support than you did 6 weeks ago." She looked at him with that layered expression. "Because of you. Because of Cora and Jeb and Sheriff Cross and the letters to the county seat. Because you stood your ground and now there's a paper trail and witnesses." He paused. "And yes, in some small part because of me." She studied him. "You should know something," she said. "All right. I have spent the last 2 years being absolutely certain that I did not need anyone. That what I wanted was to be entirely self-sufficient, because the alternative was dependence, and I had seen what that looked like for women, and I did not want it." He waited. "And I still believe that," she said. "I still believe in all of it. But I have realized in the last few weeks that there is a difference between needing someone and choosing someone, and I think I have been confusing those two things." He looked at her. The November afternoon light was thin and gold, and it was cold enough that their breath made small clouds between them. He said, "Ruth." "Yes. I came 60 miles to return a branding iron, and I've stayed 3 weeks, and I have not once thought seriously about leaving. That's not something I've ever done before. I don't have a long speech to make about it. I just want you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were very clear and direct, and she was not the kind of woman who looked away from things. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for a while." He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing. Her fingers were cold, and she turned her hand and let his close around hers, and they stood there in the thin November light looking at each other, and it felt like something opening, like a door you had been standing in front of for a long time finally being pushed through. "I should tell you," he said, "that I'm not a wealthy man. I have savings but not a fortune. I have a good horse and good skills and a reasonably sound reputation in the cattle business." "I know what you have," she said. "I've been watching you work for 3 weeks. I'm saying it because if this is a conversation about a future, you should know the full picture." "The full picture," she said, "is that you found my initials on a piece of iron in a cold campfire and rode 60 miles to give it back. Everything else is negotiable." He laughed. He did not laugh often, and when it came, it surprised him, and it seemed to surprise her too, because she blinked, and then something in her face went entirely soft and open. He kissed her. He leaned forward, and she met him halfway, and it was brief and gentle and cold-nosed in the November way. And when they separated, she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, a complete and unguarded expression, and he thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The legal situation resolved in December, not as fast as either of them would have liked, but faster than they had feared. The county seat, Clarendon, had sent a deputy to look into the land acquisition complaints against Pruitt's operation, and what they found when they looked was a pattern that had been building for 2 years. 3 other homesteaders had been pressured off their claims using methods very similar to what Ruth had experienced. 2 of them had signed over their deeds under what could reasonably be argued was coercion. The third had simply disappeared, which was the detail that made the deputy from Clarendon go very quiet and very thorough. Denton Pruitt was brought before a judge in Clarendon in December. He was not charged with anything that put him in prison, which was a failure of justice that Silas found deeply unsatisfying, but his operations were halted. His legal standing in several land transactions was called into question, and the 2 homesteaders who had signed over deeds under pressure had their cases reviewed. The Calvert brothers left the county, which Sheriff Cross said happened to men like that when the air changed, and they felt the law getting interested in them. Tom Briggs, the corrupt sheriff of Mineral Creeks County, lost his position in the following spring's election, which was a slower form of justice but a real one, and Ruth Ralston kept her land. When the word came from Clarendon that Pruitt's grip on the situation had been officially broken, Ruth sat down at her kitchen table and put her face in her hands and was quiet for a long time. Silas sat across from her and did not say anything, because there are moments that need space rather than words. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, which was the only time in the months he had known her that he had seen her cry, and it was such a private and hard-won grief and relief mixed together that he felt he was witnessing something sacred. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do the most of it. You held the ground. You didn't sign. You came back. You came back with me." He turned his hand under hers and held it. "Yes, I did." The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was cold and dry and beautiful in the specific way of the Texas panhandle, where the cold was not wet and gray but crisp and clear, and the sky above the plains was so blue on good days that it almost hurt to look at it. Silas spent the winter on the homestead, working and learning the particular rhythms of Ruth's operation, which were thoughtful and well organized, and showed the intelligence she had brought to everything she did. The cattle were managed carefully. The fences were maintained. The records she kept in a ledger book were precise and showed a small but steady profit from the previous year. He also built things. He was good with his hands in the particular way of men who had spent their lives working with rope and wood and iron, and there were things around the homestead that needed building or improving. He built a new section of fence along the east pasture. He reinforced the barn roof against winter weather. He built a second room onto the back of the house, which Ruth watched him do with an expression that combined amusement and something warmer. And when he was finished, she walked into it and stood in the middle and said, "What is this for?" "Winter storage," he said, because the second room needed to serve some immediate practical purpose while the longer purpose arranged itself. She looked at him. "You built a room the same size as the main bedroom for winter storage." "It's a lot of winter," she laughed, and he grinned, and neither of them said anything else about it because they both knew what it was. He proposed to her in February. He did it on a cold Sunday afternoon when the light through the kitchen window was the pale gold color of winter sun, and the coffee was hot, and the cattle in the pasture outside were visible as dark shapes against the dry grass. He did not make a long speech. He said, "Ruth, I want to marry you. I want to stay on this land and work it with you and build something here together. I know you value your independence, and I'm not asking you to give anything up. I'm asking you to add something." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were wrapped around her coffee cup, and she was sitting very still in the way she had when she was thinking. "You should know," she said, "that I am not an easy person to live with. I know. I have strong opinions about how things should be done. I know that too. And I don't intend to stop being myself because I'm married." "I would be disappointed if you did," he said. "I fell in love with who you are. It would be fairly stupid of me to then try to change it." She looked at him across the table. "You fell in love with me," she said, as though testing the words for honesty. "Yes, somewhere between the Cottonwood Draw and Mobetty. I couldn't tell you the exact moment." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Yes, Silas, I'll marry you." He reached across the table, and she reached toward him, and their hands met in the middle, over the coffee cups and the winter light, and it was not dramatic. It was simply right in the way that only the things that have been properly built can be right. They were married in April of 1879 at the small church in Mineral Creek, which by that point had been painted white and looked considerably more established than it had the previous fall when Silas had first ridden through town. Cora Fleming was Ruth's witness. Jeb Hankins stood beside Silas. Nell Graves and her husband George made the trip up from Mobetty, which was the kind of gesture that meant a great deal. The preacher was a young man who had been assigned to the area 3 months prior, and who performed the ceremony with an earnestness that was genuinely moving. Ruth wore a blue dress that she and Cora had made together from fabric purchased at the general store, and she had her dark hair pinned up carefully with several strands that persistently escaped it. And Silas stood across from her in the church, and thought that he had never in 28 years of living looked at anything so clearly, and known with such certainty that it was exactly where he wanted to be. When the preacher said, "Do you, Silas Collier, take this woman as your wife?" Silas said, "I do," in a voice that was steady and quiet and utterly sure. And when Ruth said her vows, her clear eyes were on his face, and she said the words as though she meant every single one of them, which was the only way Ruth Ralston had ever done anything. They walked out of the church into an April morning that smelled of new grass and warming earth, and Cora threw rice, even though she had insisted beforehand that she was not the type for such things. And Jeb shook Silas's hand hard enough to make his knuckles ache, and Nell Graves cried and was not apologetic about it. The spring that followed was the best season Silas had ever lived. He had spent his entire adult life moving from place to place, following work and weather and opportunity, and he had not fully understood what he was missing until he stopped moving. There was a particular satisfaction in waking up every morning in the same place, in a house that was becoming familiar in the deep way that homes become familiar, where the angles of the morning light and the sounds of the yard and the smell of coffee on the stove all combined into something that was simply and profoundly his. Ruth's cattle operation expanded modestly that spring with the birth of several calves, and the combined Ralston Collier brand, the double R that her father had started, became something that Silas took a genuine pride in. He had never cared much about brands before, had worked under half a dozen different outfits and never given their marks a second thought. But this one was different. This one was theirs. He also, in the spring, began the process of building out the homestead in a more serious way. The additional land he needed for the expanding operation required an improvement in the fence lines, and he spent several weeks doing that work methodically and with satisfaction. He hired a young man named Carl from Mineral Creek to help, a 19-year-old who was steady and willing and good with animals, and who became a regular presence on the place over the following seasons. Ruth, meanwhile, had found a way to apply her considerable practicality to a new project. She had been observing that Mineral Creek lacked several things that a growing community needed, and she had begun, through careful correspondence with suppliers in Fort Worth and Amarillo, to establish a modest trading arrangement with the general store that put certain goods into the area that had not been available before. It was not a business in itself, simply an extension of the community's access to the wider world, but it showed her gift for seeing what was needed and acting on it. They were not a demonstrative couple in public, because that was not the fashion of the time, and because they were both people who kept the deeper things close. But in private, in the evenings and the mornings and the quiet hours of a day's end, they were very much in love in the way of people who had come to each other late enough to be certain and early enough to have a long future. Ruth was funny in a dry and quiet way that continued to surprise him. She would say something completely unexpected at the end of a long day, and he would laugh and she would look pleased with herself in a way she tried to conceal and failed. He loved this about her. He loved her stubbornness and her precision, and the way she held her opinions carefully but without apology. He loved watching her work, loved the intelligence she brought to every problem. He loved the way she looked at the cattle in the morning when she was counting them, as though taking a personal and proprietary satisfaction in each one. She loved things about him that he had not known were lovable. She said once that she loved the way he thought before he spoke, the way most people did it the other way around and made a mess of things. She said she loved that he was not afraid of silence. She said, on an October evening almost exactly a year after he had found the branding iron, that she had known when she came down those boarding house stairs in Mobedy and saw him standing there with her iron in his hands that something was different about him, though she had not had a word for what it was. "What word do you have now?" he asked. She thought about it. "Mine," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Their first child was born in the summer of 1880, a boy. They named him James, after Ruth's father, whose first name she had not mentioned in any of Silas's earlier inquiries, but which she said now with a quiet love that made him understand exactly how much her father had mattered to her. James Collier was born in June into a Texas summer of considerable heat and considerable noise, and he arrived into a house that was ready for him, warm and solid and built with intention. Silas held him on the first evening, sitting in the chair in the main room while Ruth rested, and looked at this new person and felt something so large and so foundational that he did not know what to do with it, so he simply sat with it and let it settle. "He looks like you," Ruth said from the doorway where she had come slowly, wrapped in a blanket. "You should be resting." "I rested enough. Let me see him." He carried the baby to her, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and he sat beside her, and she held James and looked at his face with the complete and total attention she gave to everything important, and after a long moment she said quietly, "Good," as though she had reviewed the situation and found it satisfactory. Silas put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the three of them sat together in the warm room, and outside the Texas summer moved around the homestead, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the fences were sound, and the double R brand on the iron above the fireplace caught the lamplight and glowed. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because no honest account of a ranch life in Texas in the 1880s could exclude it. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary griefs of a life lived close to land and animals. There was a particularly bad winter in 1882 that killed several of the cattle and required them to use their savings to replace the losses, which they did without argument, making the decision together at the kitchen table with the ledger book open between them, and working through the numbers until they found a path that made sense. There were also occasional shadows of the past. Denton Prout had lost his grip on the area but had not lost all his influence. And twice in the early 1880s, there were small legal challenges to the homestead claim that required Ruth to produce her papers and assert her rights. Both times she did so with perfect documentation and the authority of a woman who had anticipated these attempts and prepared for them. Both times the challenges failed. The second time, the lawyer in Clarendon who had brought the challenge on Prout's behalf was officially reprimanded, and after that Prout turned his attention to other parts of the state and left them alone. The community around Mineral Creek grew during these years, filling in the way frontier communities did when the land was productive and the railroad came closer. By 1883, there was a proper school in Mineral Creek, and Ruth involved herself in its establishment with characteristic thoroughness, serving on the committee that hired the first teacher and ensuring the building was properly constructed. Silas built the schoolhouse benches himself, which Ruth pointed out was perhaps excessive personal involvement, but which he did anyway. Their second child was born in 1883, a girl they named Clara. Clara came into the world with a disposition that was, from the very beginning, considerably noisier and more immediate than James's quiet observation of things, and she rearranged the household accordingly. James, who was 3 at Clara's arrival, regarded his sister with the careful seriousness of a child who had been the only child and was now reconsidering the arrangement, and then within a week was entirely devoted to her. Watching Ruth with her children was one of the continuous pleasures of Silas's life. She was not a sentimental mother in the soft and decorative way, but she was patient and attentive and genuinely interested in who these two people were becoming. She taught them things. She taught James to count cattle from the fence before he was 5, and he learned it with the same focused attention that was his mother's defining quality. She taught Clara to read earlier than anyone expected because Clara demanded it. In the evenings after the children were asleep, Ruth and Silas sat together as they had always done, on the porch or at the kitchen table with coffee and lamp, and the comfortable and companionable quiet of two people who were very much at home in each other's presence. They still talked, still had the conversations that had been the beginning of everything between them. They talked about the ranch and the future, and the things they had read and the state of the world, and what they thought about it. One evening in the autumn of 1883, sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, Ruth said, "Do you remember what you said that first night in Mobedy, when I asked you why you came?" "I said I wasn't entirely sure," Silas said. "Do you know now?" He looked at the October night, at the stars above the high plains that were exactly as thick and clear as they had been every autumn evening he had spent here. "I think I was ready," he said. "I think I had been doing the same thing for 12 years because it was what I knew how to do, and then I found those initials and something in me recognized them, like meeting someone you've heard about for a long time." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I burned them so carefully," she said. "I remember doing it. I sat beside the campfire that first week I was on this land, and I held that handle in my hand, and I thought, this is mine, this is the beginning of the thing I'm building, and I wanted to mark it properly. I wanted to say, this belongs to someone who intends to stay." Silas reached over and took her hand. "And then you had to run. And then I had to run." She laced her fingers through his. "And you found my name in the ashes and came looking." "Best thing I ever did," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had gotten into the habit of doing. They sat together on the porch of the home they had built and kept and built further, in the October dark, with the land stretching away in all directions, theirs and certain and good. The branding iron hung above the fireplace in the main room of the house. Ruth had hung it there the week they were married, on a pair of iron hooks that Silas had set into the stone, and it stayed there through all the years, through babies and hard winters and good summers, and the slow and satisfying growth of everything they were making. The double R at the business end of it went on the cattle they raised and sold and were proud of. The initials on the handle, RR, Ruth Ralston as she had been and Ruth Collier as she was now, stayed clear and legible through all the seasons, a record in burned wood of a woman who had decided to mark her things and mean it. Sometimes visitors to the house asked about the iron on the wall, because it was an unusual decoration for a home, and Ruth or Silas would tell part of the story. The version they told publicly was simple. She had lost it and he had found it and brought it back. This was entirely true and completely left out the most important parts, but the most important parts were theirs. Carl, the young man who had been helping on the ranch since 1879, had by 1885 become an indispensable part of the operation, and in that year Silas offered him a formal partnership in the cattle side of the business, the management of the herd and the range, because Carl had earned it, and because Silas had come to believe that the right arrangement for people and land was one where those who worked it had a stake in it. Ruth had agreed with this immediately, and with the characteristic quiet satisfaction of someone who is hearing a decision that confirms what they already believed. The ranch had grown by 1885 to nearly 300 head, with a range that had been carefully expanded through 2 additional land purchases made when neighboring homesteaders decided to move on. The Double R brand was known in the area. Ruth kept the books and managed the correspondence and made the decisions about breeding and herd management with Silas, and together they had built something that was, by any honest measure, exactly what she had come out here to build. Not grand, not famous. Just real and sound and entirely their own. In the spring of 1886, Ruth told Silas she was expecting again. Their 3rd child arrived in November of that year, another boy, whom they named after Silas's own father, a man named Thomas Collier who had worked a farm in Tennessee and died when Silas was 14, and whom Silas had not spoken about very much, because he was private with the deep things. Ruth had asked him once carefully about his family, and he had told her, and she had listened with the complete attention she gave to everything important, and had not pushed for more than he offered but had held what he gave with the respect it deserved. Naming the boy Thomas felt, when Ruth suggested it, like exactly the right thing. Thomas Collier arrived into the world in November of 1886 with a great deal of energy and a head of red hair that no one in the family could account for, and that Carl laughed about for the better part of a week. He was, from the beginning, the loudest and most determined member of the family, and James, now 6 years old, regarded him with the weary patience of a firstborn who has been through this before. The winter of 1886 and 1887 was hard, one of the hardest in the region's memory, and it hit cattlemen across the panhandle badly. The Collier ranch suffered losses, as they had before, but less than many of their neighbors, because Ruth had insisted 2 years prior on putting up more hay than they thought they needed, which turned out to be exactly the right decision. They helped several neighboring families through the worst of it, opening their hay stores and their barn and their hospitality with a straightforward generosity that was not dramatic about itself. By the spring of 1887, when the worst was over and the cattle that had survived were moving on new grass, Ruth stood at the fence of the south pasture one morning watching the herd, and Silas came to stand beside her, and they were quiet together for a while. "We made it," she said. "We always do," he said. She looked at him with a slight smile. "That's a bold claim. I have evidence to support it." She laughed, that dry and quiet laugh that still landed somewhere in his chest exactly as it always had. Almost 9 years into their life together and it still landed exactly the same way, and he was grateful for that, grateful in the quiet and daily way that is deeper than gratitude spoken aloud. The children grew. James was a serious and capable boy, who showed every indication of becoming the kind of man who could take over a ranch at 20 and run it well. Clara was incandescent and opinionated, and by the time she was 5 she had opinions about the cattle that were sometimes incorrect but never uncertain, and Ruth regarded this quality in her daughter with visible delight. Thomas was pure motion and enthusiasm, and had an affinity for horses that became apparent as soon as he could sit one, which was earlier than it probably should have been. They made a life. They made it day by day in the way that lives are actually made, not in moments of drama, but in accumulated ordinary hours. And it was rich and full and entirely sufficient, and better than either of them had been living before they found each other. There was one afternoon in the summer of 1888, a long golden afternoon in August when the heat had broken for a few days, and a good wind was coming from the north, when all five of them were out in the south pasture together. James and Clara were chasing each other among the grazing cattle with the confidence of ranch children who do not fear large animals. Thomas was in Silas's arms, watching the cattle with enormous interested eyes. Ruth stood a few feet away with her hand on a fence post, watching the older two children, and the light was on her face in the particular golden way of August afternoon light on the Texas high plains. Silas looked at his wife and his three children and the cattle in the pasture and the sky above all of it, that enormous and enduring sky that was the same sky it had always been, and he felt such a completeness in the moment that it seemed almost too large to hold. Ruth turned and caught him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She understood him. That was perhaps the most essential thing through all the years and all the ordinary days and the hard ones. She understood him the way he understood her, without needing translation, without requiring explanation, the way that comes from paying close and honest attention to another person and choosing them daily. She walked over to him and stood beside him and put her hand on Thomas's back as the boy sat in Silas's arms. "It's good," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "It really is." The branding iron hung on the wall above the fireplace in the main room of their home, the double R mark at its working end, and the initials burned carefully into the handle, small and precise and permanent. The room around it had grown over the years as the house had grown, new rooms added on, the kitchen enlarged, the parlor furnished with things that had been chosen carefully and used well. There were books on shelves and a rag rug on the floor and photographs on the wall, including the old studio photograph that Ruth had kept in her document box, the one with the young woman in the chair with the careful hair and the complex expression, and beside it a newer photograph taken in the spring of 1882 in Mineral Creek by a traveling photographer, which showed Silas and Ruth and a 2-year-old James, Ruth seated and Silas standing beside her with his hand on the back of her chair. And both of them with the kind of expression that photographs of that era rarely captured, but that this one had somehow caught, which was the expression of people who are genuinely content. The branding iron was what people always noticed first. It was unusual, hanging on the wall like a piece of art, and it was worn smooth on the handle from years of use and from the hands that had held it, and the initials on it were still clear. "What's the story of that?" people asked. And Ruth or Silas would tell part of it, the simple version, the one that was entirely true. She had lost it and he had found it and come looking, and that was how it had started, and this, all of this around them, was where it had gone. The full version was theirs. The cold October morning and the 2 letters in the ash of a dead fire. The 60 miles ridden on a feeling he could not entirely name. The woman on the stairs in Mobity who held the height advantage and looked at him with that layered expression. The conversation on the porch in November where they had first held each other's hands. The kiss in the thin winter light. The year's work and worry and building and the life that had come from all of it. The full version was, he had seen her name in the ashes and known, in some way he could not explain, that it meant something. And then he had gone to find her and found that it meant everything. On a September evening in 1889, 11 years after Silas had first ridden south through the Canadian River country and found a campfire in a cottonwood draw, he sat on the porch of the homestead with his wife in the last light of a warm day and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling toward evening. The cattle in the pasture, the horses in the corral, the the children's voices from inside the house where they had been put to bed and were clearly not staying there. The wind in the cedars along the fence line. Ruth had her feet up on the porch railing and her coffee cup on the arm of her chair, and she was looking at the western horizon where the sun had gone and left a long stripe of amber light above the darkening plains. She looked exactly like herself, exactly as she had always looked, though there were things in her face now that had not been there in the photograph he had seen in the document box 11 years before, depths and lines that were the record of weather and work and love and difficulty, and the years of a life fully inhabited. She was, he thought, more beautiful than she had been then. Not differently beautiful, more so, in the way that things become more themselves over time. "What are you thinking about?" she said without looking at him. "You," he said. She turned her head and looked at him with that clear, direct gaze that he had loved from the first time it had been turned on him, standing in the boarding house in Mobity with a branding iron in his hands. "Good things, I hope." "Only good things," he said. "Always." She smiled, the full and unguarded smile that she reserved for the people she most trusted, and held out her hand across the space between their chairs. He took it. The amber light stretched along the horizon and faded slowly, and the first stars appeared above the plains, and the sounds of the ranch evening filled the comfortable and companionable silence between them. They had built this. Out of 2 letters burned carefully into a wooden handle, out of a cold campfire, and a decision to follow a feeling he could not name, out of the stubbornness of a woman who would not sign away what was hers, and the persistence of a man who could not ride past something that mattered. They had built a life and a home and a family and a herd with a double R brand, and they were sitting on the porch of it in the September evening holding hands, and the branding iron on the wall inside above the fireplace said, as it had always said, "This belongs to someone who intends to stay." And they had stayed, and it was everything.